Amos arose in the morning and offered a prayer of thanksgiving to God. It was the first he had said and meant in years. Give thanks to the Lord Almighty, for the Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love. Caravans wound their way up the Benjamin Mountains. Men pulled at roped donkeys laden with packs. As Amos walked up the mountain road, uneasiness filled him. When he reached the Mount of Olives, he stopped and stared, troubled in his soul. He thought again of the corruption he saw every time he went to Jerusalem. Priests like Heled profiting off stealing from God. Had Amos not cut his share and built his flock from those same lands? He shuddered at his guilt. What choice had those priests given his father? Frustrated by helplessness, he tried to make excuses. None sufficed. Words spoken long ago, when he was a child attending classes, came back to him. Burning words that rent his conscience. Hear, O Israel, you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all of your strength. Love had not motivated his rebellion against Heled, nor had righteousness or any desire to worship the Lord. He had not loved God. He had blamed the Lord for the trouble men caused and the contract under which his family lived. Each time he went to the temple, he did so grudgingly and offered only what was required to keep in good standing with the authorities. Uzziah might be king, but all too often it was the priests who ruled the lives of common people like himself and his brothers. The Lord is God. But even now, as he stood looking up at King David's Zion, Amos knew idols still pocked Judah's landscape, and pagan altars still remained, despite King Uzziah's attempt to destroy the foreign gods that had dwelt in the hearts of King Solomon's wives and concubines. How could a wise man be so foolish as to build pagan temples and altars? Amos saw the remnants of those gods as he moved his flocks. Sometimes he had been tempted to follow the processions up the hills so he could spread himself beneath the leafy branches and enjoy the sensual pleasures offered there. It had not been fear of the Lord that kept him away, but fear of leaving his flock unattended. You must not have any God but me. You must not make for yourself any idol of any kind. Sin was everywhere. It was in the nations surrounding Judah and Israel. It was in Israel and Judah. It was in him. Not once have I sought out one of the few priests known to serve in fear of the Lord. I've held my anger close, embracing it, fanning my hatred against all your priests. I have rebelled against you. You must not misuse the name of the Lord your God. Amos cringed. Yes, Heled and others like him were guilty, but Amos's family had entered into a contract that dishonored God as well. How many times had they used God's name to seal a bargain? Stand aside, someone shoved him from behind. Amos moved out of the way, seeing everything differently. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Did the gates of Jerusalem not stand open for trade every day of the week? The markets of the great city never rested. Amos watched the beehive of activity as merchants bore their wares into Jerusalem, past elders holding court at the gate. Other commandments came in a rush. Honor your father and mother. You must not murder. You must not commit adultery. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely against your neighbor. You must not covet your neighbor's house. You must not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female servant, ox or donkey, or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Amos closed his eyes. Though he had never broken these commandments in deed, he knew he had broken every one of them in thought. He had loved his father, but had been bitterly disappointed in him. Not once after he had learned the truth had he believed anything his father said. And how many times had he lusted for revenge against Heled? He had even thought of ways to kill him, savoring the thought in his mind. If he could have found a way to kill the priest and escape, he might have done it. From the time he was born until 2 years ago, he had been a thief, a party to priests who testified falsely against those who brought perfect offerings to the Lord only to have them rejected. As for the sin of coveting, had he not coveted the priest's power, freedom, and wealth? He had not so much wanted it for himself as he had wanted to see it ripped from the hands of that had grasped it and held on at such cost to the people. Amos saw what God wanted him to see and stood mortified by the sins of the people, sins he himself had committed on a daily basis. And when God spoke, his next words were no surprise. The people of Judah have sinned again and again, and I will not let them go unpunished. They have rejected the instruction of the Lord, refusing to obey his decrees. They have been led astray by the same lies that deceived their ancestors. The hair on the back of Amos's neck prickled. He dropped to his knees and covered his face. He rocked forward, covering his head with his hands. No, Lord, please don't show me. He drew his knees up under him. Have mercy on us. But the images came upon him relentlessly, melting his heart and filling him with the sorrow and compassion he had never felt before when looking upon his own people. The compassion he'd felt until now only for his defenseless sheep. That's what he felt. And he wept. You there, you're blocking us. Hauled up, he was pitched aside and fell heavily. Stay off the road. Heavy wheels crunched the rocks. Oxen blew out their breath. The voices of 1,000 people mingled as Amos saw in the dust his head in his hands, sat in the dust, his head in his hands. To what end, Lord? To what end will you destroy the people you chose? From the ruins, I will rebuild it and restore its former glory, so that the rest of humanity, including the Gentiles, all those who I have called to be mine, might seek me. What are you doing back so soon? Danny rose from his money table. When he came close, he frowned. What's happened? Is Ittai well? I've not seen Ittai or Elkinan in months, remember? They had finished their business with Joram before I returned with my flock. They came here to Jerusalem before I did. Ahiam closed the gate of a stall, a lamb in his arms. The boys went home to Tekoa not long after the New Moon Festival. Amos looked at his two brothers. The Lord spoke to me. I have seen visions. Ahiam laughed. Go sleep off the wine over there. He walked away with the lamb. You probably had a fever, Banny searched Amos's face. You do look ill. I have seen the destruction of Jerusalem. You're mad. With Uzziah on the throne? Banny shook his head. Jerusalem is secure and our borders are protected. But I'm telling you the truth. I saw fever-induced dreams. Amos Banny gripped his arm. That's all besides. Why would God speak to you, a shepherd? You're not a member of the priest guild. You're not a Levite. When God speaks, he talks to one of the trained prophets or priests. You go over there, sit. You look tired. He led Amos to the bench beneath the canopy where their tables were set up for business. Amos saw the open box with its neat rows of coins and shuddered. Banny slapped him on the back. Have some wine, little brother. Eat something. Forget about whatever you thought you saw. You'll feel better. Banny poured him a cup of wine and offered him bread and dates. You spend too much time alone with that flock of yours, little brother. You always have. The hum of conversations merged with the bleating sheep until the sound seemed the same. Amos clutched his head. Am I going mad that men are beginning to sound like sheep or sheep are beginning to sound like men? Ahiam returned. Heled is not pleased to see you, Amos. Joram gave him a bad report when he returned from Tekoa, and Heled hasn't forgotten. Amos raised his head. If you don't end your dealings with that thief of a priest, you and your family will suffer for it. Ahiam's face hardened. Live your life, Amos, and leave mine in peace. He gave a hard laugh. If we took your advice, we'd all be living in the hills, half starved and seeing visions. Leave him alone, Ahiam. He makes trouble for us. Even when he can keep his mouth shut, he allows his contempt to show. Look at him. Ahiam leaned toward Amos. You look like a beggar. He's given both our sons a start on flocks of their own. A lot of good it will do them if he keeps on as he has. Everything we've all worked for over 2 generations. It'll be gone. He glared at Amos. It happened before. Remember what Father told you? It can happen again. Don't think it can't, he jerked his head. You forgot who holds the power around here. Amos rose, shaking with rage. God holds the power. Chin jutting, Ahiam came close enough to stand nose to nose with Amos, and he gave it to them to use as they will. Amos stood his ground. The people of Judah have sinned. All of a sudden, you're the judge? Ahiam gave him a hard shove. Go home, prophesy to your sheep. Listen to me, Amos cried out in desperation. If you made any sense, I might. Ahiam glanced back over his shoulder. Send him home, he nodded at Banny. We've got a business to run here. Turning his back on them, he walked toward the customer, looking over the lands. Smiling, he spread his arms in greeting. Banny drew Amos aside and spoke quietly. Go back to my house. A few nights rest in a good bed and some of my wife's cooking, and you'll be yourself again. Amos knew he would never be the same again. Everywhere he looked, he saw things differently than he had before the voice had spoken to him. Dream or no dream, his life had changed forever. Amos left the Temple Mount and its stalls of sacrificial animals, passing tables where money changers stacked shekels and half shekels. He went down to the market square where bellowing camels with tasseled harnesses stood laden with huge packs of merchandise. The animals were lined up behind owners who displayed their wares on woven rugs. The scents of dung and spices mingled while the vendors shouted their wares, competing with one another as possible customers wandered the bazaar. Shekels clinked and money boxes slammed shut. Donkeys burdened with bundles were pulled along by hard-faced men, cursing and making threats if others did not make room. Luncheoned by the sound, Amos sought quieter streets. He wandered along narrow alleys lined with booths. Vendors haggled with customers over prices while competitors called enticements to steal patrons away. Good shepherd, one called to Amos. Come, you need a new pair of sandals. Those look worn through. I'll give you a good price. I will give you a better price. He's a thief. Don't listen to him. I have better. Here, come look at what I offer. The narrow street widened, and Amos stopped to watch stonemasons working on a new house, a foreman shouting instructions to his crew. A few doors down, a carpenter worked on a cart. Wheels of all sizes lined the wall of his shop. Another man planed a table while his wife showed a bench to a woman with 3 children. On another street, metalworkers pounded ingots into utensils while coppersmiths pounded trays. A goldsmith displayed earrings, bracelets, necklaces, and cylinders ready for engraving into family seals. Weavers sold cloth and rugs on another street, while the next was lined with bakers. Amos's stomach clenched with hunger, but he didn't stop. He had no money with which to buy. Distracted, he took dried grain from his script to ease the ache in his belly. He wandered into the valley of cheesemakers and back up to the canopied stalls with baskets of barley and wheat, jars of oil, jugs of wine, bins of olives, and baskets of early figs. Combs of golden honey dripping into bowls, while nearby another merchant called out balm for sale. Rug merchants and basket weavers called out to him as he passed. A tent maker haggled with a customer. Jerusalem was indeed a city of wealth and commerce. The people seemed to want for nothing. What they lacked had little to do with the body and everything to do with the heart and soul. All their strength was spent on what they could hold in their hands. Pausing, Amos listened to a young man playing a lyre for a customer while his father attached strings to a kinnor. The customer pointed to a beautifully carved 10-string nebel displayed alongside rows of bone pipes. The boy picked it up and began to play it. At a signal, the boy handed the instrument to his father. He allowed the customer to hold it, plucking the strings and stroked the carved wood. Amos picked up some reed pipes and admired them. The lust to own would seal the bargain. He put them down quickly and walked away. Amos went through a gate and down a pathway. Weary, he sat in the shade of a mustard plant and leaned against a wall. Hyssop grew from between the stones. Across from him was the Mount of Olives. It was quiet here, quiet enough to think, though pondering what he had just seen was the last thing he wanted to do. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I see sin, Lord, enticing, tempting, seeming to delight and bring satisfaction. I see it, I see. Pride promised pleasure and security, but would bring despair and death instead. Amos walked home in the moonlight. He went to the fold and entered by the narrow gate, walking quietly among the animals, checking each one. When the sun rose, he would let them out into the south pasture. Soon it would be time to lead them away from Tekoa. One of the lambs heard his voice and came to him quickly, pressing against his leg. Amos hunkered down. Yes, I'm home, little one. He rubbed the lamb's face. Go prophesy to my people. Confused, Amos stood. Israel? He spread his hands, looking up at the sky. The northern kingdom, Lord? Samaria? Go to Bethel. Why would God send me to speak to the 10 tribes who had broken away from Solomon's son Rehoboam? Hadn't they followed after Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, foreman of Solomon's workforce? Why not call one from among the 10 rebellious tribes to prophesy into their breakaway nation? I told my brothers I'd seen visions. They didn't believe me. They thought I was drunk or suffered from delirium. The lamb bleated. The flock sensed his turbulent emotions and moved restless, nervous. Shh, it's all right, sheep. Amos lifted the lamb. He moved slowly among his animals, speaking softly, soothing their fears. He set the lamb down and moved to the gate. Drawing his reed pipe from his belt, he played whatever sweet melody came to mind. The sheep settled again. Amos looked up at the stars. Before the visions began, he had believed that God didn't notice him or what he did or thought. Now he realized God saw and knew everything. Still, Amos didn't understand why God would call a poor shepherd, a simple, ordinary man, to speak the word of the Lord. My love is unfailing and everlasting. I will be with you wherever you go. You love me, and yet you send me north with a message of destruction? Even as he wanted to question, Amos knew why. God had filled him with understanding and was sending him to call his lambs back from destruction. Had God ever given a prophet a message the people wanted to hear? A message they welcomed and celebrated? Perhaps Israel would listen this time. Even to a shepherd? Why wouldn't they? When the visions God had given him showed the destruction of enemies that surrounded them. Would they celebrate just as he had before he understood that the sins of Judah were not hidden from God's clear and holy gaze? Wealthy, powerful Israel would gloat even more about the judgment upon the nations and probably gloat over the destruction of their Judean brothers as well. For then Samaria would become the city on the mountain. Or would it? Solomon's foreman had crowned himself King Jeroboam I with dreams of a dynasty to follow. To carry that out, he had abolished the Levitical priesthood and established his own. He had turned the people away from Jerusalem by setting up golden calves for them to worship in Bethel and Dan. They'll do all these things, Lord, and yet Judah is to be destroyed? How can I say these things? How can I leave my own people and go to them? Judah. What of Judah? You will be my prophet in Israel. My spirit will come upon you, and you will speak the word of the Lord. Amos felt the weight of his calling and went down on his hands and knees to plead with God. I'm not a city dweller, Lord. You know that. I'm a shepherd, a man of flocks and fields. I hate going to Jerusalem, and now you want me to go to Bethel, a place even more corrupt? I've done everything I could to stay away from cities. I can't bear being around so many people, and the noise, the confusion is unbearable to me. I'm just a shepherd. I am your shepherd, Amos. Will you obey me? Though the words came softly and full of tenderness, Amos knew the course of his life lay in the answer. I am not worthy. I have called you by name. You are mine. But Lord, you need someone who will make them listen. You need a powerful speaker. You need somebody who knows the law. You need someone who will know how to persuade them to do what you want. He bowed his head ashamed. You need someone who loves them, Lord. And I don't care what happens to them. I don't need anyone, my child. I want you. Go to Bethel, Amos. My grace is all you need. I will tell you when to speak and what to say. Grieving, Amos hung his head. What about my sheep, Lord? How can I entrust them to hirelings? He looked up, gulping sobs. My sheep! Tears ran down his cheeks. No one loves them as I do. A quiet breeze blew softly through the winter grass, and God whispered, Feed my sheep. Amos slept fitfully at the gate of his sheepfold, waking before dawn. He sat on the wall and gazed at his animals. He knew the traits and personalities of every one of them. He had saved one from a ledge, another from an attack of a lion, another from floodwaters of a wadi. Some stayed close, never venturing far from the flock, while others were prone to wander. Some learned quickly, while others seemed destined to get themselves into trouble with every new pasture. His heart ached because he loved them. Feed my sheep, the Lord had said last night as dusk came upon the land. Forgive me, Lord, but I care more for these animals than I ever cared for people. Men take care of themselves. They do what they want. Sheep are helpless without a shepherd. Even as he said the words aloud, he wondered if they were true. He saw things differently this morning. Maybe it was the visions of destruction that haunted his thoughts. Feed my sheep. Were men like sheep? He had always thought of them as wolves or lions or bears, especially the priests who could make life miserable if they so chose, and even tear it apart. But what of the common people, men and women like him, who wanted to do what was right, but often ended up doing what was expedient? He had been taught never to argue with a priest, but his heart had often raged within him. He turned toward the north, thinking of Bethel. This city of the northern kingdom was not far away, only 11 miles, but it seemed a distant country. His journeys had kept him in the pastures of Judah and Benjamin's territory, always circling him back home to Tekoa. Bethel was the last place he wanted to go, but he would have no peace until he obeyed the Lord. In the cool of the morning, Amos spotted Elkanah and Ithai as they led their flocks out into the pasture. Amos remained on the wall of his fold, watching his nephews with his flocks he had started for them. What he saw pleased him. Stepping down, Amos opened the gate and led his sheep out. Elkanah and Ithai saw him and raised their hands in greeting. Amos headed toward them. Elkanah greeted them warmly. Uncle! As soon as Elkanah withdrew, Ithai embraced him as well. You spend less time in Jerusalem each year, Ithai laughed. Jerusalem, sorrow gripped Amos as the vision came flooding back. Jerusalem. How long had he despaired at what he saw there? Never had he felt such a wave of sorrow as he did now, with dark, wrenching memories of the future. He stayed with his nephews for the rest of the day, listening to their stories of predators thwarted, sick lambs tended, wandering sheep found, sheepfolds expanded to accommodate more animals. Amos understood. Rather than go out alone with their flocks, they had stayed together, sharing the burden of tending the sheep. His moment came to speak. I've been called away. Elkanah glanced at him. Away? When? Where? Before sunrise tomorrow. He leaned heavily on his staff and swallowed the lump in his throat. Add my flock to yours and tend them as I would. Elkanah looked at the sheep and then at Amos. Should we stay here in Tekoa until you return, Uncle? No. Take them to fresh pastures. The pastures of Jericho are open to you. If Jashobeam questions you, tell him these are my sheep. I paid for grazing rights by working in his sycamore groves. If I have not returned by the time you come back here to the winter flocks, take only the best lambs to Jerusalem. His pulse raced suddenly as he remembered the Lord roaring like a lion inside his head. Whatever you do, do it as the Lord would have you do it. Do what is right, no matter what others do. Run from evil. Elkanah stared. What happened, Uncle? The Lord has shown me what will happen to us if we don't repent and turn back to him. A flood of questions came from his nephews. Amos found solace, and they did not suggest he rest. They did not tell him to eat something so that he would feel like himself again. Sin brings death, my sons. Do what is right. Convince your fathers of this. God sees what men do. He knows their hearts. Do what is right and live. We will tell them, Uncle. They seem troubled, even if they could be convinced. Would Ahiam and Benai listen? Amos doubted it. Benai might consider turning away from the business practices that had made him prosper, but not for long. Ahiam would wear him down and turn him back to worshiping prophets. Amos remembered how his father's conscience had suffered, but Ahiam and Benai had lived most of their lives in the shadow of the temple among corrupt priests that saw nothing wrong with what they did. Now they equated their increasing wealth to God's blessing on what they had done. Uncle, why are you crying? Amos struggled against the emotions overwhelming him and tried to keep his voice steady. I must go to Bethel. He headed across the field. Bethel? But Uncle, how long will you be gone? I don't know. A few weeks, Lord? A month? A year? Silence. Maybe it was better not to know. And that's the end of chapter 2.